Hello everyone. Welcome back to a new video and a new story. This story was made by 7ways56, so please check them out. Now let's begin. Sitting from his chair, or more of a throne of all things, a man looked over the data on a tablet. A frown formed on his face as he looked at one of the trending videos. Tapping the screen, he saw a recording of people in a collapsed rumble of a burning city being saved by someone. I am here. The man looked at the paused video, looking at the smile on the face of the person in it. The face of the new hero, All Might. A curse escaped his mouth at this. So close to taking him out years ago. He clutched the side of his chest. His predecessor got too close to comfort by stopping him from putting an end to him while he was still a student at UA. Damn it, I am getting careless. Looking at the tablet, he knew. If his predecessor could push him near his limits, then her successor might finally be able to end him. The thought of dying had crossed his mind quite a few times in the last 200 years. It never came to that, but the last fight was close. If I fall, then my whole empire will fall with me. For 200 years he had control over the criminal underworld. His control over his home country was practically unopposed, while his reach across the world was weaker but noticeable. He practically ruled the nation at one point. He placed his hand on his shoulder. The scar still hadn't healed even after all those years. Getting up from his chair, he swiped his tablet. An idea started to form in his mind about what he could do. What better way than to prepare a successor? As he was about to turn off his tablet, he stopped and stared at one of his files. It was on his experiments in trying to combine quirks within people. It even held his attempts at removing and giving quirks from animals. Next to it was some of his data on attempting to clone quirks. Gears in his head started to turn as other ideas started to form in his mind. He could create a successor as well as something else. He had a lot of quirks that he couldn't properly use after all. I never once tried creating life. The results were better than he had expected. At least 8 of his creations seemed to be developing with few to no negative effects. In the screen was their genetic information of one of them. Most of the DNA was human, though heavily altered and mutated with add-ins from animals, a lamprey to be exact. On other monitors showed the genetic strains of the other 7. Some barely even looked normal, with their DNA being heavily altered and barely human. This was of course not even counting the quirks he had given each of them. A fusion mix of several quirks, which likely was the case for the problems in the other 8. When active, the effects would likely be extremely transformative for some of them. The sound of alarms caught his attention. One of his facilities was being raided. Pulling it up, he looked at which one it was. His eyes widened in shock. Facility 12, where subject number 6 was being grown. Typing away, he prepared the defenses of the facility. Another set of alarms was going off in a few of his hideouts, and finally here. He didn't get to turn on the cameras as his intruder burst through the wall. Rubble littered the ground in front of him as he looked at the imposing figure. All Might. The screens behind him soon flashed off as the man looked at the pro hero in front of him. Not even going to bother to knock? It ends here. All Might looked at the man in front of him. There was a change from his usual shine in his eyes. He had no intention of bringing this man in. It's been 200 years, but you will finally pay for your sins, All for One. All for One tried to hold back his desire to laugh. 7 others had told him this, and each and every one of them had failed. Sure, he was certain All Might could do it. Who knows, perhaps he would finally get to fight someone his equal. Really, now that's what you want me to write on your tombstone? All for One's body seemed to grow as electricity and fire arched from his body. So be it then, All Might. Looking at him, All Might got into a batting stance. Unknown to either of them, this would be the first time they would fight. It wasn't going to be the last. In 5 years' time, they would have a rematch with a more definitive outcome. As the two fight, All for One's commands to her facilities would be heavily damaged and in many cases corrupted to the point of uselessness. The 8 beings would soon form on their own. These 8 were meant to be his successors in the case of his death. Those born to take over his spot and lead the criminal underworld. Their destinies were now up to fate. Inko Midoriya sat in her flat, having whipped away her tears. Both she and her husband had been trying for a child, only to hear the news that sadly this could never be. Inko had spent the next few days in depression at this, crying her eyes out. The sound of the door opening up caught her attention as her husband Hisashi walked in. Inko, you would not believe what had just happened. He was in his pro-hero outfit. Well, the remains of it anyway. He was thankful he had it made, with the attention of it being bulletproof and resistant to explosions. What madman could afford military-grade defenses? This was the last time he tried something like that. Until his next undercover mission, that is. Well, first I ended up in a raid on a hidden lab, then I found someone. Inko looked up and noticed that in her husband's hands was a bag wrapped in a blanket. Inko almost seemed to shoot up at this. Her husband had brought a baby with him? Hisashi, why did you bring a baby with you? Hisashi rubbed the back of his head. He had a lot of explaining to do. A few minutes later Inko held the baby in her arms as Hisashi finished his explanation on why he had brought the child with him. During his last undercover mission, he learned about an underground lab owned by someone in the criminal underworld. From what rumors he had heard, the lab was doing illegal biological experiments. After fighting his way through the lab defenses, he had found the child in a tube. Inko looked at the child in her arms. The thought of her being experimented with was the first thing to cross her mind. Though when Hisashi found out that there was no record of a missing child that fit her description. From what I could manage to get put, I think they might have been using it to create someone for, I don't know, maybe a weapon? A weapon? Inko looked at the little girl in her arms. She didn't look anything like a weapon. Why, would they make someone to only be a weapon? Hisashi shrugged his shoulders. There was any number of reasons, from wanting a means to kill a hero or more unsavory ends. After all, there was a lot of reasons to make it female. Pushing those thoughts aside, Hisashi let out a sigh. Inko, I know that this might be strange to ask, but maybe we could adopt her? Inko didn't complain at all. In fact, she looked at him confused. I thought we already did. Hisashi had a chuckle at this. Leave it to Inko to adopt the girl on the spot. So, you have a name for her? Inko thought about it for a moment. They had only really agreed on naming a son Izuku. After a few moments of thought, she held the baby up to her. How about Izuka? The child had a happy smile at this. You like that name, don't you? Rain fell from the sky as the bloody hand of All For One touched the wall as he braced himself. The water washed over his wounds and the remains of his outfit. His other arm was broken and his leg was twisted, but in the end, All Might had failed to kill him. Thanks to the timely intervention of the lair collapsing on the both of them. He focused on the healing abilities from his stockpiled quirks. His wounds closed up and his broken and twisted bones mending themselves back to place. All Might had done a number on him. I'm surprised he came over here now. With his wounds healed, he pulled out his phone. He tried to see if his network was intact but couldn't get anything but static. For a second he cursed at this before he composed himself. There was nothing to worry about. All 8 of them would be taken care of by the automatic systems for a time and eventually wander into the wider society. It would take years, but perhaps his children would be able to finally meet back up with him. Soon, though, the feeling of pain shot through his body. The adrenaline had faded away, and with it, he realized how much pain he had been in. All Might was here and his planned successors could take years to track down. Ever pragmatic, he knew that there was a need for him to not put all his eggs in one basket, so to say. As he walked down the street, he saw something. A boy in the street sitting outside with the only thing besides the clothes they were wearing was a severed hand. A hopeless look was on his face as he just stared out. I think I might have found what I was looking for. Hisashi looked out at the city. The pro-hero looked at the mission that he had offered to take up. He was going to be away from his wife and daughter for a long time. Such is the pain of a hero who went undercover infiltrating some of the more dangerous criminal organizations. A sigh escaped his lips as he pulled out his phone. On it was talk about All Might and a collapsed villain lair off the coast in a small island. Why All Might had gone there was anyone's guess. Theories ranged from the more sensible to the completely ridiculous. Seriously, even after 200 years, people still believed in the New World Order. It had overshadowed his raid at a suspicious underground lab. A lab was he had found his now daughter as part of some experiment. If it wasn't for his recklessness with the defense, they might have had more information on why she was there. A part of Hisashi even wondered if it was a good idea to basically just choose to adopt her. Shaking his head, he banished those thoughts. Inko was happy to have her, and he was sure that she was going to grow up and become a fine young woman. Who knows, maybe she'll take up the family business and become a hero. One could only dream that this would be the case. Still, he wondered about just who had requested or made her and for what reason. Pulling out his phone, he wondered if he could give a few of his friends a call about this. There's something going on, and for my new daughter's sake, hopefully I can find out. As Izuka grew up a normal life, she had no idea about what she actually was. When she was 7, she had learned that she was adopted. Surprisingly, nothing changed between her and her parents. At least that did explain why her quirk seemed different from her parents. Still, a few questions did echo in her mind about her origins. Who were her birth parents and where did she came from? Hisashi and Inko were rather hushed about this. I'm the few years Hisashi hadn't made much in the way of figuring out who and why Izuka was made. There were rumors about some powerful being ruling the shadows and looking for individuals. Hisashi had a terrible feeling that Izuka was one such person. With her parents hushed about it, Izuka eventually stopped asking. Her mind turned instead to her dream as the years went on. Yet, soon the answers will be coming for her. Whether she was ready or not. On several monitors was some news articles. Having lost contact with each of his creations, he had waited until they showed up in the headlines. So far he found 4 of them. The last one making themselves known not long ago. A new update caught his attention. All Might was spotted taking out a villain with a sludge quirk. All Might, distaste was within his voice. The symbol of peace had put him in this mess. You will get your due soon. He stopped as one of his Trojan programs had finished a sweep. These were decided to locate any strange quirk registrations. It was one form he had in hopes of finding his creations. The program pulled up several files. Izuka Midoriya? According to the parameters, the Trojan program was supposed to locate any suspicious anomalies with quirks that matched one of the 8 combinations he had designed. To also help with the search, it looked for medical reports that seemed rather off, especially for the world they lived in. An image appeared on the screen of her with a few of her strange medical anomalies. Anomalies that was due to her quirk altering her DNA, as the official statement goes. These anomalies were not all due to a quirk. A smirk formed as he now knew that 5 of his creations were running around. Seemed Subject 6 is doing well. Despite the alterations to her genetic structure, it seemed she was fine medically speaking. A few of the doctor's notes on this made him want to chuckle. Likened to a vampire? He'll admit he had planned a theme for each of his creations. Subject 6 was in simplest terms based off of a vampire, along with a few other things that he really shouldn't tell others. A part of him wondered if she had any bit of the combat and personality indoctrination within her mind. With his system down and the years that have passed, it likely was buried within her subconscious. Who knows, she probably would. Looking at the rest data from the stolen medical reports, he found a location of the doctor's practice. It was a pleasant surprise, really. So she likely lives somewhere nearby as well? For a moment he actually felt a bit of joy at the prospect. He had to lay low and couldn't move to any of his facilities. When he finally tried, All Might had tracked him down. Needless to say, he couldn't go about finding them. Perhaps I will keep this to myself for now. He could work on finding out about Subject 6, or Izuka as her caretakers had decided to name her, at a later time. Right now he had other things to worry about. His position in the underworld was under fire by upstarts. You get critically injured one time and suddenly everyone who you kept down wants your spot. Sitting at her desk trying to ignore the other students, Izuka continued to write in her notebook. Their teacher had gone on about their future before just tossing away the test papers. He knew that most of them wanted to become heroes, so it was kind of pointless. Izuka didn't look up, knowing that her class had basically used this time to show off their quirks. All except for her and one other person. Their teacher waved his arms to get the class to settle down. Alright, I know you all have some impressive quirks, but unless they are a mutation quirk, then you can't show them off in class. Most of the class stopped using their quirks at this. Near the front row, one of the students in the class had a cocky grin at the teacher's words. Don't lump me with these extras, they'll be hard-pressed to be sidekicks. The rest of the class, save for Izuka, looked at him annoyed. Izuka drowned out the resulting argument. Katsuki Bakugo had possibly one of the most versatile quirks in the class. His ego tended to match that, and as such, he called his class extras and even forgot their names. All except for one of them. Izuka, aren't you also trying for UA? No sooner as those words left their teacher's mouth did everyone turn to the silver-haired girl. Katsuki turned to her with annoyance and anger on his face. The rest of the class seemed to take a step back. Her and Katsuki relationship was best described as an intense rivalry. When they were younger they were friends, thanks to their mothers being friends, until Katsuki's quirk appeared. He turned into a bully and treated his friends just short of garbage. The last straw was when he decided to pick on another student. That was the day Izuka quirk activated. Well, at least part of it did. Everything was a blur, but when she came to, Katsuki was unconscious while the taste of blood was on her mouth. To this day Katsuki still had the scars, though faded over the years, of where her lamprey-like mouth had bit him. That wasn't the only she was able to do, as other powers started to manifest over the years. Some of which she was a bit hard-pressed to use. A few of the students whispered to their friends as they felt the tension between the ash blonde and the silver-haired girl. The sound of the bell was heard overhead and a few of the students chose then to get out of class. Katsuki slammed his hand on Izuka's desk. He had a hardened glare on his face. So Deku are trying out for UA? It was a promise back when they were friends. Katsuki made her promise to get into UA with him. Before he got his quirk, and their friendship nearly decayed to a rivalry. One which Izuka kind of didn't want. We did promise each other Kaken. The ash blonde picked up her notebook and looked at it. Written on it was theories on her quirk. His hand seemed to be smoking from small explosions building up. Hey, give that back now. Katsuki had already burned one of her notebooks already. A small part of her wanted to grab him by the neck, and while that was a tempting thought, she pushed it aside. Whatever, Katsuki tosses the notebook back at her. Stay out of my you walking corpse. She could feel her right eye twitch. It was a little insult he had created. After she revealed she didn't need to breathe and her skin light lavender shade, something Katsuki noticed happened to dead bodies. That insult was occasionally dropped by him because of it. It wasn't the only insults he tended to give her. The temptation to grab him and start struggling Katsuki crossed her mind. No, remember to banish the dark thoughts. Katsuki walked out to the courtyard to meet with his two lackeys, for lack of a better term. The two of them looked at him with confusion on their faces. At least one of them remembered when they had fought Izuka 3-on-1 all those years ago. Why do you still antagonize her? For a moment Katsuki recalled something back when they were kids. When Izuka pointed out how much of a jerk he was being and standing up to him. Then when he thought he had won, she got back up and turned into that thing. After that, it was a blur, but he knew one thing. Izuka had defeated him and he wanted to settle the score. Remembering it caused his expression to harden as he gave the two of them a borderline death glare. Shut up about it. Speaking of the girl in question. Izuka walked out and caught sight of them standing in front of the main entrance. She decided to take the other way home instead of walking past them. As she walked down, she pulled out her phone. Her mom was texting her about what she had wanted for dinner tonight. Switching out to the news, seeing an article about a mysterious creature in the woods. This didn't last long when she heard a voice behind her. A little girl cloak? Coming out if the sewers was a man made up of sludge. A bit small, but it will do. He launched himself at Izuka, who jumped out of the way. Another tendril shot out and grabbed her arm. Got ya? Izuka's hand glowed as a blast of condensed light hit him. The effect actually burned the sludge man and forced him to let her go. Ah, you bitch, that actually hurt. It was kind of the idea. Izuka was about to cut herself and turn her blood into a weapon when someone else made himself known. Have no fear, they both turned as standing at the entrance to the bridge was the #1 hero himself. Because I am here. The sludge villain forgot all about Izuka. Now it was back to the man he had spent almost 3 hours trying to escape from. All Might. Before the sludge villain had even a chance to escape, All Might's throw a powerful punch. The air itself being pushed away by the shockwave of the force within it. Texas smash. The villain was broken apart by the shockwave, covering the whole tunnel in his remains. As well as Izuka, who tossed off a piece of him. Oh, my apologies. Despite being covered somewhat in a villain made of sludge, Izuka was inwardly having to hold back fangirl squeal. All Might was her idol, much to her father's amusement and sadness, so meeting him was something she had always wanted. She took out her backpack and noticed that it was open and her notebook was missing. Wait, where is it? As All Might was finishing up cleaning the sludge villain from the tunnel, his eyes fell on a notebook. Picking it up, he saw the detailed descriptions of quirks. Both hero and villain, as well as their uses, some of which was theoretical. If a villain got a hold of this, it probably won't be all that bad, but still having a leg up on the enemy was no laughing matter. He turned to the first page to see who the owner was. Izuka Midoriya? Midoriya was actually a familiar name to the symbol of peace. He was an undercover hero who had on more than one occasion helped All Might with a case or helped heroes with a raid on a secret base, black market deal, or the like. A bit willing to do what needed to be done to earn the crime boss loyalty, but no hero was perfect. He turned to Izuka as he put 2 and 2 together. I take it this is your notebook? Izuka was pulled out her frantic search before taking the notebook back. Yeah, she looked through it, making sure that nothing had been torn out. That's when she saw All Might's signature on one of the pages. He actually signed it. Izuka Midoriya, you wouldn't happen to be related to Hisashi Midoriya, would you? All Might revived a nod from Izuka along with a bit of an uncertain look. It wasn't like she didn't see them as her parents. Far from it, she actually couldn't see anyone else raising her. Not knowing her origins had slowly started to gnaw at the back of her mind. Didn't help that they kept deflecting it whenever she would ask about it. I'm his daughter. All Might raised an inquisitive eyebrow at her tone and expression. Something was amiss with her. Now that he thought about it, she didn't look like the undercover hero. At least from the images he had seen. Is something the matter? Izuka looked away for a second. She had a bit of a mental debate on telling him. It's just, a sigh escaped her lips. I am adopted and I've been wondering about my origins. Ah, that explains it. In this world of quirks, being adopted was much more of a big deal than it used to be. Quirks were either combination of one's parents or a similar ability to one of their parents, bearing the rare mutation from one of their parents or the combination of their quirks. With those that had mutations either brought on by their quirk or inherited from parents who had them. Well, that can't be that hard. A quirk and DNA test could solve that. Izuka had a chuckle at this. What's so funny? It's just that's already been done. She knew of the anomalies within her medical reports. Never mind that she had never gotten sick or needed to breathe. Her mother had noticed it long before taking her to the hospital. From the doctors, they learned another strange tidbit. Some of her organs didn't properly function in the way they should normally. The later of which was stunning, especially since they gave off the illusion of organ failure despite still working. The strangeness was chalked up to her quirk, which no specialist had ever seen. The genetic tests had no known matches to anyone. It was a dead end. Something was nagging All Might. For a brief moment, his mind flashed back to that night 5 years ago. The final fight with his nemesis, which nearly ended in his own death. In the fight, he had revealed that he had made 8 creations that would take his place even if one for all defeated him. All Might didn't put much thought into it, thinking that he was just trying to get into his mind. What exactly can your quirk do? Izuka thought about it for a moment. She usually didn't take time to actually list all it seemed to let her do. Well, I seemingly don't need to breath. I can generate burning light, manipulate my or other blood, create creatures from some kind of darkness, turn into a monstrous form dash. Wait, what? All Might had to stop her there. Quirks, while not being fully well known, did have an upper limit of what they could do. Sure, certain quirks could do a whole lot of things, but they were usually rated to something that a single quirk could do. Secondary powers that were required thanks to their quirk. How dash? Before All Might knew it, his body was consumed in a stream of mist as he felt a stream of blood escape his mouth. Inwardly he was cursing himself for forgetting about his time limit. Izuka just looked with a stunned expression. Before her, All Might, the muscle bond symbol of peace, was replaced by a man that looked like a skeleton with skin. All Might? She shook herself from her shock as she yelled out. What's going on? Toshinori really didn't want this to happen right now. He had hoped to have a short chat and instead he was sidetracked. All Might's greatest secret had just been revealed. Quiet down or someone would hear you. There was no choice, he was going to have to tell her and hope she didn't cause trouble. Look, this is a complete secret, so I don't want this on the internet, all right? Izuka gave him a nod in confirmation. Whatever this was, it was serious and important to All Might. I won't. Toshinori let out a sigh before pulling up his shirt, showing the half-collapsed chest and the wound just over where his lung was. Pretty gruesome, don't you think? Toshinori could feel the pain of hitting his limit. Staying in hero form for the full 3 hours caused the scars to act up. 5 years ago I fought a villain. This was not a known fight, very hushed, and in it, he did this to me as a parting gift. Toshinori put down his shirt. After the resulting surgeries I lost half my respiratory system and my stomach, and as such, I can only hold my All Might form for 3 hours. Silence befell them as Izuka took this in. All Might, the symbol of peace, was basically crippled. If this ever got out, then villains would be less inclined to stay hidden. Her father had told her about the consequences of losing such a hero. His time in India taught him that after their number one hero had fallen in battle, he had to pull out from his undercover mission because of the fact the group he was infiltrating got extremely bold. Well, I got to get this guy. Toshinori tapped the soda bottles now filled with the unconscious sludge villain's remains. To the police. Toshinori turned to walk away before stopping and returning his attention to her. Say, are you seeking to become a hero? Izuka gave him a nod with a small smile. Having been raised by a pro hero and having spent much of her life watching videos of them, she had always dreamed of it. Yeah, I'm hoping to take the entrance exam for UA in 10 months. Well, then I hope to see you there. Toshinori walked away with a wave. Izuka continued on her way home for a few minutes before stopping. She turned around with a confused look on her face. Did he just imply he was going to be at UA? After thinking about it for a few moments, she just shrugged. I probably misheard that. Toshinori's mind was racing. No sooner as he had given the police the sludge villain did his thoughts turn to the girl he had met. His mind was racing back to his fight, to his words. 8 creations, 8 children in a way as he called them, all of them made to take over his empire and continue the fight against all that was good. Did I really just meet one of them? It sounded hard to believe that his nemesis could have done something like this. From what his predecessor had told him, attempts to give someone another quirk rarely worked with the body it was given. If the person was lucky, the quirk would merge with any existing quirks within the person or cancel both of them out. Most, however, were mentally overloaded by the quirk and were reduced to mindless flesh dolls. His quirk was an exception given how it functioned. The idea seemed so far-fetched and out there. Though thinking about it some more, there was one thing all these attempts had in common. They were normal humans, well as normal as the quirked kind were to their ancestors at least, and as such had limits that the human body could take. With the advancements in genetic studies, especially in the last few decades, it was very possible that he had made sure they were anything but normal. Never mind, he could have also mixed the right number of quirks together. A feeling of dread started to creep up his spine. More he thought about it, the less impossible it sounded. If Izuka was one of such beings, then not only was it a plausibility, then it must have happened. For just a moment he cursed himself for killing his nemesis. As soon as that thought entered his mind, he immediately crushed it. Nothing should ever make him regret that. A voice came over the intercom. Now boarding the 5:40 train. Getting up, the ghoulish-looking man followed a group of people to the train. Taking his seat on the train, Toshinori pulled out his phone and looked over his contacts. There was only one person he could trust to look into this. After a few moments, the call picked up. "Hey, it's me, Toshinori, I need your help with something." A stream of fire shot out, burning away some of the washed-up trash to ash. Hisashi took a seat as he looked out at the beach. The ash blew away in the salty breeze of the sea. Every time he came back from a mission, he would come to the beach. Mostly to clean it up from all the trash. Seriously, you would think that after nearly ending up a trash heap 3 times that the beachgoers would clean up their trash. Smoke escaped his mouth as he rolled his eyes. He wasn't mad, just really disappointed. He turned to the side as he noticed that someone walking up to him out the corner of his eyes. Hisashi turned and gave Izuka a smile. "I guess Inko told you to come and get me?" Izuka gave her dad a nod as she looked out at the few piles of ash. The sands had been blanketed with a black taint from where some of the ash had mixed into the sand. At least it's not a makeshift dump. Turning back to her father, Izuka remembered the attack by the sludge villain. "I had a run-in with a villain today." Hisashi looked at her with a raised eyebrow. If anything, he expected her to get into a fight with her old friend Katsuki. He stood up and crossed his arms. "You didn't tell your mother about it, did you?" Her red eyes avoided her father's green. She wanted to, but her mother would worry about her and probably start panicking about her becoming a hero. She had enough worry with her husband. Rather than explain to her father why she didn't, Izuka decided to, "I met All Might today." The pro knew that she was trying to push aside the question. Even though he was going to have a talk about her a bit later, Hisashi figured that with meeting All Might and getting attacked by a villain, it was high time he decided to train her. "Since you obviously don't want to talk about why you didn't tell your mother," a smirk formed on his face as he watched his daughter realize her attempt at pushing away the question had failed. "Why don't we get started on your training for the UA entrance exam?" Hisashi didn't have any missions to do. The police didn't need an undercover agent, and well, he wanted to spend this time getting her ready for UA's rather difficult entrance exam. With the right planning, she'll be ready for it by the time the exam began in 10 months. With a clap of her hands, he decided on what they should start on. "Alright, we'll get started with quirk training, so first things first, how well do you know how to use your quirk in a fight?" Izuka shrugged her shoulders. Outside the tussle with Katsuki back when they were kids and the sludge villain, she really hadn't used her quirk for combat. Though she did understand what it could be used for and all she could theoretically do. Not at all. "Well, that's why we have 10 months to change that." Hisashi motioned for Izuka to follow him. The two walked out to a more secluded part of the beach to begin Izuka's training. Inko looked at both her husband and their adopted daughter. A conflict of emotions with her. The two of them had come back a little late for their family dinner, with Hisashi looking a bit injured. "Inko, it's nothing, I was just training Izuka for the entrance exam." The greenette had reasoned that much. With the entrance exam in 10 months' time and her husband home for that time, it made sense for him to train Izuka for it. "Then why do you have dried blood on you and several cuts and bruises?" Hisashi blinked before remembering that. Strangely enough, he had forgotten all about that. Izuka stopped taking a sip of her crimson red, metallic tasting drink and looked away. Hisashi rubbed the back of his head nervously. Well, you see, I thought we could start out with Izuka fighting me to see what she could improve on. That, of course, turned out to be a surprise for the both of them. I think we were both surprised by what happened. Somehow Izuka, to her shock as much as Hisashi, was far better at fighting than she first let on. Actually, for much of it, Izuka could only remember a blur of motion. As if something in the back of her mind knew what to do. Thinking about it, Hisashi figured it had something to do with when he found her. A person investigation that he had every time he could. Having spent years undercover, he had a good idea of where to go in order to get information on this. There was but the bare bones. Besides, the lab where Izuka was found, at least 2 others had been located by criminal groups by accident. At least the rumor went. Going to where both labs were supposed to be located, Hisashi, of course, found them raided. Anything of value pulled out of them. The few bits of data the computers could produce was about how they had failed to properly gestate. This confirmed that his daughter was likely lab-grown for something. Can't you both be more careful next time? Inko had a pleading look on her face. This wasn't what she had in mind when she thought of Hisashi training Izuka. Hisashi waved his hand and gave her a comforting smile. Sure, don't worry, Inko. Sitting at her seat, Izuka finished with her drink as she thought back to the spare with her father. A part of her couldn't wait for it again. For a moment she had an image of her fighting and manhandling Katsuki. She shook her head from those thoughts. Remember to banish the bad thoughts. Cherry blossom leaves fall through the breeze as Izuka stood at the gates of UA. All around were people here to either try out for the hero course or the other classes that the school offered. Support courses for those looking to make devices and look into joining a support company. Others were here for the business course, and if she remembered, there was also a general studies course which gave a normal education like any other school. As she walked around taking in the sights, she was soon greeted with a familiar voice. Deku. Right, she had almost forgotten that he was taking part in this as well. Katsuki walked up to her with his usual scowl on his face. You actually showed up. Izuka shot him a glare. In the past 10 months, he had been slowly pushing her buttons. Trying to get the fight that she knew he wanted. It was getting harder and harder to ignore the impulse to slam him through the walls at school. Her hand was twitching, ready to grab hold of him. I told you I would. If you have a problem with that, then keep it to yourself, Kaken. A smirk formed on her face. Now it was his turn for his eye to twitch. He always hated her pet name for him. Izuka knew this and always made sure to use it in a way that one would talk to a pet. For all his bravado, he never seemed to want to act on it. After all, if he did, then she won. Listen here, I'm getting first place, you hear me? Katsuki walked away without much more fanfare. Izuka had a smirk at this. She felt rather happy making him look like a fool. Why did I do that? Izuka had never tried antagonizing him before. Whatever the case, she just shrugged and took a step forward and managed to kick her own feet by accident. Really? Before she could end up face first on the pavement, she felt herself suddenly floating. Blinking for a few moments, she turned to her side and saw a girl with a roundish face and brown hair standing there with a hand outstretched. Sorry, you looked like you were going to fail, you know. She tapped her fingers together as the pull of gravity seemed to return. Release. Izuka stood up, having landed without an issue. Thanks. Izuka held her hand out to her. I'm Izuka Midoriya. Nice to meet you, I'm Ochako Uraraka, Ochako replied with a smile. So, you're here for the entrance exam for the hero course as well? Izuka gave her a nod. A question crossed her mind concerning what had just happened. Hey, so if you don't mind me asking, what does your quirk? Ochako was surprised by the sudden question. Well, see, my quirk lets me manipulate gravity on whatever I touch. She showed out her fingers where Izuka caught sight of little pads like that of a cat. I used to think it only let me cancel it out when I was young, though after a while I learned I could also increase the gravitational pull on an object. That sounded amazing to Izuka. If only she didn't leave her notebook back at home. Say, what about your quirk? That's rather complicated. Izuka noticed as several students started to walk towards the buildings. The tests were starting soon. We should probably get to the auditorium, we don't want to be late. It seemed the universe did have a twisted sense of humor. Katsuki and her were seated next to each other. Izuka didn't even need to turn her head to him to know that he was giving her a glare. Just ignore him and he will go away. That was somewhat wishful thinking, but it was either that or do the more unsavory thought she had to deal with him. The lights dimmed as everyone looked up on stage. Walking out was a man who looked ready to fall asleep. Shota lazily looked at the applicants as he stood at the podium. All right, listen up as I don't want to repeat myself. He looked at each of them before his eyes turned to his paper. As stated on your pamphlets, you will be taking part in mock battles. Appearing behind him on a screen for the silhouettes of 4 robots and a mock city. Each robot had a number next to them. From 0 to 3. There are 4 kinds with only 3 having any point value to them. The 3 robots appeared on the screen. They each have a set point value from 1 to 3, the last image was of the robot with 0 points next to it. The last one has no points to it, and if I am frank, fighting it would illogical for more than just its point value. That caused Izuka to raise an eyebrow in curiosity. Shota rose up a card in his hands for everyone to see. Now you each have one of these, which are printed a site where you will be taking your test. Izuka looked at her card, seeing that it was listed with Training Ground B. Out the corner of her eyes she saw that Katsuki had Training Ground A written on his card. They must have done that so participants from the same school don't team up. Knowing their relationship, that would likely never come to pass. Katsuki would more likely try to fight her than team up. Katsuki caught sight of her card and seemed a tiny bit mad at this revelation. I'll still get first place. Looking out the monitors, most of UA's staff. On each screen was the participants all gathering just outside their test areas. Sitting on one of the chairs that were provided was the principal of the school, him. One of the rare instances of a quirk appearing in an animal. This seems to be a somewhat smaller batch this year. Nizu looked at each of his teachers, including the newest one. Strange, Toshinori seems focused on the monitor for Training Group B. Indeed he was, as it was the group where he had spotted Izuka. His friend had managed to look from records and talked to some captured petty criminals. With some doing he did manage to locate a few abandoned labs hidden in secret, one of which had been broken into long before the others. Several of their computer programmers managed to pull up what they could. Subject number 6, a mix of altered human DNA and a lamprey. The idea that his nemesis would do something like that was somewhat unsettling. Who knew what could have happened, though at least there was a reason behind it. Mixing animal DNA surprisingly made the accepting of the chimera quirks that each of his creations were given easier. Still, confirming that it was Izuka took getting her medical reports, which gave strong backing to the idea of her being Subject 6. Even if she was made to become something of his successor, he looked as she stood out with a sports outfit waiting for the doors to be open. It seems that just like anyone, she has a choice with what to do with herself. Unknown to him, Nizu was looking at the monitor that he was focusing on. The principal wondered why Toshinori seemed to be so fixated on test site B. Could it be he has his eyes on one of the participants? Nizu thought about it. Such a thing wasn't out of the realm of possibility. That much was certain. Better keep my eye on whoever it is. On the next few seats, a few of the teachers were looking at the applications that each participant submitted, one of which caught the attention of a staff member with a somewhat questionable outfit. This one doesn't have a name for her quirk. What do you mean, Midnight? Nizu's question was answered as Midnight handed him the application. Sure enough, the quirk name wasn't listed. Even being quirkless was placed on the quirk registry. Izuka Midoriya? The last name was somewhat familiar to him. Very strange that her quirk doesn't have a name. From his seat, Toshinori was not surprised. With such a quirk it would be difficult to actually name. For a moment he actually wondered the full list of quirks that were merged into hers. He did interrupt her before she could finish after all. Izuka was honestly bored just standing around. She looked around at the other participants waiting for the test to start. As she looked around she found Ochako off on the side of the group. Looks like we got the same test site. Before she could go over and talk to her, Shota walked up. The tired-looking man stood to the group. All right, everyone begin. The group turned to him, missing that the doors had just opened up. He rolled his eyes at how illogical they were acting. Well, what are you waiting for? Izuka turned around, being the first to realize that the test had begun. Before she knew it, someone practically raced past her like a blur before everyone else joined in. As they all disappeared through the gate, Shota took note of the girl. He ran before everyone else. At least she has more sense than all the others. As Izuka raced through the streets of the mock cityscape, she kept her eyes opened. From out of one of the corners a 2-pointer jumped out. Its eye glowed as it locked onto her. Target locked, you will be terminated. It opened up its missiles to launch at her. Izuka jumped out of the way of the explosions. On landing, she took a bite out of her finger, drawing blood. From the small wound, a large amount of her blood flowed out before forming into a crimson-red lance. Izuka had a wicked look on her face as she jumped forward and pieced right through the robot. As the remains of the 2-pointer fell over, more robots made themselves known. 3 1-pointers and 4 2-pointers. All Izuka saw was more targets. Light gathered in her other hands as she jumped forward to meet them. Each robot locked onto her. Target locked, you will be dash. The lead robot didn't get to finish before it was torn down, followed by the one behind it. For a moment Izuka didn't care about anything else. She was going to finish this test and that was all that mattered in her mind. Come at me then. On the screens, the UA staff watched each test site as the scores started to pile up. It was only the beginning and already they could see two students climbing up faster than the others. On one screen was Katsuki blasting away at every robot in his path. On the other was Izuka wielding a lance made of blood as she tore apart robot after robot with it and a light-based energy attack. The staff just watched as both of them continued to shred through the robots as they came towards them. The two of them have already passed the 20-point mark and the rest had practically begun. True enough, the other participants had yet to get even halfway to the point and it just seemed that the hap was increasing. Say, Midnight, didn't they both come from the same school? Midnight looked through the applications again. Once she found them both, she gave her coworker a nod. Yeah, they both have the same middle school listed. You don't think they trained together for this? Looking at the screen, Nizu wasn't so sure. He wasn't as good at human interactions, but in his eyes, he could see something of fierce determination on the face of Katsuki. With the way both him and Izuka kept alternating from the lead, it seemed to him that they were almost in a competition of sorts. Perhaps a rivalry exists between the two of them. I'm more questioning how the girl was able to still stand after making such a weapon with her blood. Without any idea on what the quirk could do, they just chalked it up as an emitter class. Tashinori in his seat actually figured that just like not needing to breathe, she either didn't need her blood or could regenerate it fast enough that it wasn't an issue. Nizu continued to watch, his attention more on the two who were in the lead. Looking over to Izuka, the animal principal couldn't help but feel a little nervous about her. The look in her eyes and the expression on her face. There's just something strangely unsettling about her. Izuka's score seemed to stop raising as it looked like there weren't any robots near her. That didn't stop her as she continued to run through the mock city looking for the next robot to destroy. All the while the other student scores were catching up to hers. The blood lance was pulled out of a three-pointer as Izuka looked at the destroyed robots around her. 2 one-pointers and the three-pointer in front of her. That should make 63. Izuka heard a commotion nearby and raced out, coming across a plaza with many robots within it. She looked to see someone kicking a two-pointer, breaking it apart as it fell over. Landing there, a tall boy that Izuka had recognized as part of the group looked at the down robot. That's 67. He was just 4 points ahead of her. She felt anger at this with a tiny bit of confusion at this feeling. On the side, she saw a laser being fired as a one-pointer was destroyed. Standing there was a blonde with a strange face, which was saying something, standing there with a metal belt around his stomach. 59. Up in the air, Izuka caught sight of robots floating in the air. They then smashed into one of them before falling to the ground. Izuka saw Ochako standing just off from the robots, taking a few deep breaths. That's 60. Over the speakers, the group could hear Shoto's voice. Alright, less than 5 minutes remaining, you better be ready. There it was, his choice of words, which caused Izuka to wonder what he meant. The sounds of a building being destroyed caught everyone's attention. A large robot looked down as the participants in the plaza. Its eye glowed red and ominously. Exterminate. It was the zero-pointer, and only now did Izuka realize what the man was getting at. Unlike the other robots, this was big and very likely made not to be used as a test. The others in the plaza decided to run either from it having no point value or because they couldn't take out the massive robot. All except for one of them. Izuka looked up at the zero-pointer while everyone seemed to just be running away. Izuka looked at the robot in front of her almost like something of a challenge. Holding the lance made of her own blood up, a light surrounded it at the ready. It's only then that she had heard a yelp of pain. Looking in front of her, Ochako had been pinned down by fallen debris. Before she knew it, she seemed to further infuse the light-infused blood weapon and toss it with all her might into the air. It pierced into the robot and blinding burning light exploded with it, causing the zero-pointer to fall over with much of its upper half mangled and destroyed. Several of the participants stopped and looked on with which on their faces. Even Izuka seemed a bit surprised by what has just happened. Wait, did I just fight it because I could? Her thoughts on the matter were soon interrupted as the sound of horns blaring marked the end of the test. Time's up, everyone, Shoto's voice echoed through the speakers. You will receive your letter of acceptance or dismissal in a week's time. The teachers just watched as the recording of Izuka defeating the zero-pointer replied before them. It wasn't every day a participant decided to take on the thing. Given it had no point value and was meant to be an obstacle, there was no point. Well, now as impressive as this is, we all know that there was more to it than a participant fighting the robot. Nizu tapped on his tablet, showing another recording. Izuka Midoriya took out the robot to save a fellow participant. Toshinori had a small smile at this. It seemed to be the case, and that brought some relief to his troubled mind. Despite being a creation of him, she was still her own person. Looking at the panel of secret judges, he mused about what was to happen. She managed to get 63 points, more than enough to make it into UA. Each one held up a score as the secret points in the test was tallied up. The top 10 then appeared before them, with Izuka moving into the group. Well, overall I say they are among the best we had in a while. Everyone got up to leave while Nizu stayed. The animal principal continued to look at the recording of Izuka fighting the robot side by side with Katsuki. Normally I would avoid putting the two of them in the same class. They were from the same school and likely know one another growing up. A rivalry possibly existed between them, and the look on their faces. Nizu stopped himself and shook his head. I am going to regret this, aren't I? At least they had a homeroom teacher who could deal with them both should the need arise. Besides, it wasn't like putting them in the same room would bite them in the end. I do hope Shota can handle them both. At that moment, far away from him, the man in question felt a shiver run down his spine. Something told him that Nizu was going to make his life a lot more stressful. It's probably nothing. Izuka looked at her father, wondering if he was actually serious. Hisashi had gotten called in to do another uncover mission in the States, but in celebration of Izuka entrance exam, he had ordered her something. Izuka just couldn't believe what he had gotten her. You seriously got me a lance? Hisashi gave her a nod in confirmation as he held said object up for both her and Inko to see. During their training, Hisashi had noticed how much she seemed to prefer making a lance and using in combat. With a few calls to some people that owed him a favor, he was able to order one specially made for her. Well, it's not like heroes having a weapon are not unknown, plus I figured it can count as an early birthday present. Inko just looked at her husband, wondering if he was crazy, casually giving their daughter a weapon as a gift. Izuka just looked at the weapon that her father gave her before taking it. I don't think I'll be able to take it to school with me. Hisashi has a smile before producing a form for her. It was an approval to have the lance with her. That wouldn't be a problem. He then twisted the lance handle as it seemed to pull itself back and folded into a long staff, plus the designer used their quirk to make it and to fold in. With a further twist, it shortened into a small pool. This way you can take it with you. Hisashi, are you seriously considering letting Izuka take it with her? Inko finally voiced her disapproval at such a crazy action. What if there is an accident with the other students, or worse, what if Izuka pokes her eyes out? Hisashi looked at his wife, wondering if she had forgotten that Izuka had a healing factor. Was she starting to get overly paranoid? Well, besides the fact that it's not sharpened at the end, I'm sure nothing like that would happen. The sound of a knock on the door caught their attention. I wonder who that could be. As he left both Izuka and Inko to themselves, the brunette woman looked at her daughter. Izuka held the object that her father had given her. Being honest, she really did like the thought of having a lance on her. It would go well with the costume, I submitted. Hisashi came back waving a letter in his hands. A ladder with UA's on it. Izuka, it's finally here. He handed her the envelope from UA's seal on it. Why don't you go open it in your room while me and your mother talk for a bit? Izuka gave him a nod as she walked out of the room, taking the folded lance with her. Hisashi let out a sigh as he turned to Inko. Dear, you really should calm down a bit. I wouldn't give something like to Izuka unless I felt she was perfectly capable of wielding it. I know it's just, Inko tried to answer back, but Hisashi placed his hand on her should. The two of them already knew the reason why. They worried about Izuka in their own ways. Within her room, the silver-haired girl pulled the envelope open as a hollow projector dropped from it. The device was soon turned on. I am here, as a projection. All Might's image was a surprise to see on the projection. Izuka blinked as she remembered something said almost 10 months ago. Was this what All Might was talking about? All Might? Yes, it is I, All Might. He shot his trademark smile and pose. As well as UA newest teacher. Now she understood what he meant. All Might was going to be a teacher at UA. Now, then Izuka Midoriya, you aced the written exam and in the practical, you managed to get 63 villain points, more than enough to ensure your place at UA. Izuka didn't have any doubts on that front. Though she did wonder where she had ended up compared to the others taking the test. However, Izuka stopped and looked at All Might. A recording of her destroying the zero-pointer appeared on the screen. You did something befitting of a true hero, saving your fellow participant when everyone else chose to run. All Might looked to the side while Izuka looked at the recording. The truth was she wasn't thinking about saving Ochako when she did that. It was only after seeing her that it had crossed her mind. Even then it was only secondary. Before Izuka could complicate the weirdness of all of this, All Might turned back to her and continued, "Such acts do not go unnoticed, which is why we have rescue point." The screen behind him showed a shadowed-out ground holding up scores to actions of participants helping others. Izuka Midoriya, you are awarded 60 rescue points. The scoreboard appeared as Izuka looked at her place. First with 123 points. The only person with triple-digit points. Looks like Kaken got second place. She could just picture what was going on with him right now. Katsuki glared as he looked at the scores. At number 2 he found himself with 83 points. He was in second place. He looked up at who had gotten first place. Smoke and small explosions could be seen cut out of every sweet pore on his body. At number 1 was Izuka with a nearly 40-point gap between themselves. Fucking deku. Down in the living room, Mitsuki rolled her eyes. Her son needed to learn to stop obsessing over Izuka. I wonder what happened this time. Shota looked at the potential students that he had to choose from for his homeroom. Well, except for 2 which Nizu had insisted that he place in his class. He rolled his eyes at this. He ordered me without making it seem like it. He has seen the recordings of the entrance exam and both of them looked almost like they were having an unofficial competition amongst themselves. Great, hopefully, they won't destroy my classroom. He wished he wasn't being serious. A few years ago he had let 2 students in who had a very heated rivalry in their old school. One day he entered into his classroom and found it a complete mess and said students fighting on the floor. Lucky them that neither got expelled, but the person who caused them to fight was. Great, one of them has the power to use explosions while the other has the power to turn blood into a weapon and use light blasts. Shota wondered if Nizu was doing this as a form of revenge for bringing his cat over that one time. He goes on about him being some kind of unknown animal, but Shota knew he was a mouse. The most common animal used in lab experiments was a mouse after all. Midoriya? That name sounded familiar to him somehow. After a few seconds, it finally hit him where he had heard that name from. Oh, so she's the daughter of a pro then? Makes sense as to why she was so good. Though if he did recall, wasn't Fire Breather's quirk the ability to literally breath flames? From the recording, Izuka showed none of that. Probably has her mother's quirk, or perhaps she's adopted. And that's it for today. What a thrilling story. Please subscribe and like the video for more like this story. And don't forget to leave any comments you may have.